So I'm going to talk about felony-friendly employment, whether that means felony-friendly employers, how to find them, and especially about these infamous felony-friendly employer lists that are passed around prisons all over the United States. These are lists that, have a list like Kroger, Walmart, something like that that says, or Sears, that these are companies that will hire people with felonies. There are a ton of problems with these lists. And so I want to talk about those lists specifically, but then I also want to talk about like some advice or strategies when it comes to finding felony-friendly employment. Now, you might be incarcerated right now and you're in the process of planning to get out. And so you want to understand kind of what the landscape looks like. You might be formerly incarcerated and you're watching this, in the free world. Or you might be somebody who has a loved one who is currently incarcerated. Maybe it's a family member or just a friend, but you are trying to do your best to understand what they're going to face when they get out and understand how you might be able to help them. So that's the focus of this discussion, is felony-friendly employment. Now, some of the things that you might hear are going to just really discourage you, both if you're incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, or just the family and friend of a loved one. It's going to sound very discouraging. So as I list, point 1, point 2, point 3, I don't want you to think that the whole reason I'm making these videos and having these discussions is to discourage people about what it's going to be like when they get out. I'm actually very optimistic. I have probably more optimism about the ability of somebody who's been in prison to get back on their feet and become successful and get right back into society. I'm probably more optimistic about these things than many people. It seems like in this field of work, there are a lot of people who are very pessimistic. In fact, the reason that I got the job that I'm now in is because it seems like the basic assumption is that things are terribly difficult for someone to get a job when they get out of prison. And that seems to be like the number one driving factor when it comes to reentry programs, reentry services, or reentry specialists. The driving or dominating assumption that people have is that reentry just means you're a staffing agency. So if I'm a reentry specialist, that means really on the cool, I'm an employment specialist. I'm somebody who is skilled in getting people jobs, but I'm skilled at getting people jobs who happen to have been to prison. But that is really problematic for a number of reasons. This is not the discussion for that. I will make a separate series of discussions about why that is a problematic assumption. My point here is just to say that a lot of people are pessimistic about what it's like getting out. And I can't lie, it is hard, but I am actually pretty optimistic about it, and I'm going to explain why in this series. So just to be clear, I'm not trying intentionally to discourage people, but as I list a lot of these bullet points that you need to keep in mind, it's going to seem discouraging, but ultimately I'm going to end this on a note of optimism. If a person is getting out of prison and they're really determined, ambitious, perseverant, if they have a lot of grit, they're going to be successful. I know this I can say that pretty confidently. So the first thing I want to talk about is what I call the landscape of reentry or felony-friendly employment. So the first big discussion to have is providing you with a bigger context of what things are like across the whole country. So I'm in Texas, so my knowledge is not just Texas-based, but I'm much more familiar with what's going on in employment in urban cities in Texas like Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. But I want to say something about the whole landscape of felony-friendly employment across the nation. Number one, I get asked a lot from grant organizations and foundations, people that want to provide grant money to people who are involved in reentry. I get asked from instructors and people in the prison systems, and I get asked by just regular citizens, and legislation, political legislation. Policymakers want to ask the question, what kind of jobs can a felon get? That's the dominating question. What kind of jobs can people with a criminal background obtain? That's the question that policymakers, philanthropists, grant organizations, instructors, people who are working in corrections, that's what they want to know. But one of the things I found is that the question is backwards. No longer, past 2021, But like in 2023, the question is no longer about what jobs can felons get. That's backwards. The question should be, what jobs can they not get? The reason it is backwards is because our culture has shifted so completely in its attitude towards people who have served time in prison. Now, you might be a pessimist or a cynic, you might be skeptical about these things, but I'm telling you that just as it stands, for the last 15 years especially, the whole attitude that people in this country have towards people who are serving time in prison or have served in time in prison has shifted dramatically. The question we need to be asking is not what kind of jobs can a felon get? The question should be, what kind of jobs can they not get? That answer is much shorter than what kind of jobs can a felon get. And I'm going to explain why right now. So 20 years ago, there began a discussion about second chance provisions at the federal level. So the Second Chance Act. There became grants and money available for people who were helping others come out of prison. In 2008, with the Obama administration, there began an increase in efforts to help people who were coming out of prison. And then especially in 2015, when he announced the Second Chance Business Pledge. Right after 2008, a book was published called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Whatever you believe about this book, whether you really believe in the argument that she provides in that book or you don't, the point is its effect on the culture was huge. As a result of her arguments laid out in that book, people at the federal, state, local, at grassroots organizational levels began to move or start a movement towards criminal justice and second chances in a way it had not before. She actually says this in the 10-year anniversary of that book. She did an update to that book now. Ultimately, I don't really agree with most of what the book is actually about, but it doesn't matter because the point is when it was published in 2010, it slowly began to influence people across the country in its views of how people in prison were being treated, and especially once they were out. So in the early 2000s in the United States, second chance discussions began at the federal level. In 2010, there was this book published by Michelle Alexander, which really influenced a lot of people who are currently active in that scene today. A lot of what Obama did during his time in presidency increased efforts towards this end. And his Second Chance Business Pledge in 2015, 2016 is one of the things I want to focus on right now. So the Second Chance Business Pledge was his attempt to get employers around the country to publicly sign on to this list saying that they were willing to give people with criminal backgrounds a second chance. Now, it did not specify what criminal backgrounds really meant, what kinds of felonies were included or excluded, but the point was, there were companies all over the country who signed onto this list and said that they were willing, as an employer, to give people a second chance who had a criminal background. So major companies like Google or Georgia Pacific, they were on this list. So when it comes to felony-friendly lists, that was a list that I would consider to be reliable because these companies put their name out there in front of the whole nation. Now, a lot of the names on that list at some point largely began to be like universities and colleges and academic jobs, but there were still some major jobs. Like I said, Georgia Pacific, the railroad company, or Google, or Xerox was on there, I believe. That list is ended in the sense that companies aren't putting their name on that list anymore. I tried to get my job to put our name on that list, but they're not accepting names anymore. But that was a really important moment, I think, in what it meant to be somebody with a felony who was looking for a job. And now you could go online and look at this list and it had information about companies that were willing to hire you. Well, after Obama was the Trump administration. So regardless of what you may think about Donald Trump, what was interesting to me is that for everything Donald Trump said in opposition to Obama, when it came to criminal justice reform, he didn't try to push a bunch of legislation back when it came to the things going on in the American criminal justice system and the prison system. So, a lot of times when you have a huge change in a presidential administration, they try to push back on the previous administration. And Trump definitely tried to do that with a lot of Obama's policies and what they implemented during his time as president. But what didn't change in a negative way, or what he did not push back on, was some of the efforts in criminal justice. So, for example, under Donald Trump was the First Step Act was signed. Under Donald Trump, April was named the Second Chance Month. So now every April we have Second Chance Month. But regardless of what you might think of Obama or Trump, the point is you have two executive administrations that were very opposed to each other on most issues. But when it came to criminal justice reform, Trump just continued down the line of opening up opportunities for people who are currently and formerly incarcerated. And what that says to me is that criminal justice reform and improvements and offering second chances to people who have been incarcerated is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It's a United States issue. So when you see these two administrations, which were deeply opposed to each other on so many issues, and yet on this, they were almost in one accord, I think that says something about the country as a whole. At least when it comes to the people who are actually getting out there and voting, the country as a whole believes that there needs to be more done in our criminal justice reform, and especially for those who are coming out of prison. So remember that I said a lot of the things I'm going to say are discouraging, but I have an optimistic outlook. And so it's this cultural context is really the reason I have such an optimistic view about your chances of becoming successful and getting a job upon release. So the first thing is that there have been legislation almost for 20 years that have moved in the direction of helping people currently and formerly incarcerated. We saw that with the Obama administration, and the Trump administration only moved that along. Another important development that we saw was the restoration of Pell Grants for people who are currently incarcerated. So in 1965, people incarcerated could begin using federal Pell money in order to attend college. So the college that I currently work for was established back in 1965 and the college was established in the 1930s, but they began offering education to people in prison in Texas in 1965, 66. And a lot of that was on the basis of Pell eligibility for people who are incarcerated. Well, in 1994, under Clinton and Biden, all of that stopped. Pell money could no longer be used by people who are incarcerated. But in 2020, Congress voted to bring it back. So in July of 2023, federal Pell money will be made available to people who are incarcerated to attend college programs in prison. So this is just another huge step in the direction of increasing access for people currently and formerly incarcerated to the kind of thing that will help secure their future, which is education. Now, another important cultural movement, in my opinion, is there's a growing movement of formerly incarcerated people like myself. In fact, I'm using the word formerly incarcerated. I'm not using ex-convict. I don't personally have a problem with the word ex-convict, but a lot of the language has changed in this environment when it comes to criminal justice. So like in Texas, people who are currently serving time in prison aren't going to be referred to as offenders anymore. They're going to be referred to as either residents or inmates. And people who used to be incarcerated, like myself, aren't be referred to as ex-convicts or ex-offenders anymore, but formerly incarcerated or justice-impacted citizens or returning citizens. Again, whether or not you agree with that change in the language, it's just a fact that most people in this space, this sort of criminal justice and correction space, have adopted that language. And the fact that it's sort of taken over at a policy level is just another cultural indicator that things are improving or making progress towards giving people currently and formerly incarcerated more access. Well, one of the grassroots movements has been among people like myself. There's an organization right now called the Formerly Incarcerated College Grad Network. And so it's a group of people like myself who have served time in prison, but also pursued education, college, either while we were in prison or when got out of prison. And it's a national network with, I think by now, representatives in all of the states and even some overseas. And it actually is more of like a professional network of people who have served time. I was released in late 2004. I didn't learn about this organization until 2017. And I think that's because FICGN, I don't think they even were formed until 2017. Another important cultural indicator was that I want to say in 2012, 2013, a group began holding conferences on higher education in prison. So the National Conference for Higher Education in Prison has been going strong now for over a decade. It started off small, and now it's a national professional conference for people who are either working in prison systems across the United States or have served time in prison systems across the United States, who are working together to develop access to college level education in prison. And it's only growing and growing every year. So when it comes to these formerly incarcerated college grad network, or in my case, I started one here in Texas called the Texas Formerly Incarcerated Reentry and Education Network, or Texas FIRE Network for short. So our goal is essentially the same as the national one, but we're just focusing a lot more on people in Texas, and we're focusing not so much on people who went to college while they were incarcerated, but pretty much anyone who has been to prison and wants to better themselves through education. That's the kind of person we're there for. Well, when it comes to people like myself across the country, we are getting what I would call non-traditional jobs. And this is a key factor. So when I said earlier that the question is no longer what kind of jobs can a person with a felony get, I said it should be now the reverse. What kind of jobs can a person with felonies not get? That's because traditionally, when we think of somebody with a felony, we think of them getting a job in like construction, hard labor, blue collar work. And when I say that, I'm not undermining blue collar work at all. I'm just saying that the norm in times past was that if you had a felony, then you were destined to only be able to work in either hard labor, some kind of construction, vocational, blue collar job, or some menial job like minimum wage, fast food job, or something like that. Well, that's no longer the case. So when it comes to what kind of non-traditional jobs people are getting who have been served time in prison, well, one, I'm an adjunct professor in a college program inside the prison system. So I'm not just going back into the prison system as a volunteer. I'm a contract employee of the state prison system, and I go in with an ID and I'm able to teach at the college level people serving time in prison. So that's not vocational, that's not construction, that's not hard labor in the sort of physical sense of that word. But I am by far not the only one. There have been many people in Washington, Florida, New York. So Reginald Betts is one, he's in New York, who have become lawyers, passed the Bar Association, and in some cases actually took the Bar Association of their particular state to court so that they could have access to not only taking the bar, but becoming an official lawyer. So there have been people in different states who are now lawyers who serve time in prison. And not just, they didn't just do small crimes. So Reginald Betts in particular went to prison for carjacking. There are also formerly incarcerated folks who are professors at universities. So Christopher Beasley is a professor of psychology who, in fact, just obtained tenure. He's a tenured professor at, I want to say, University of Washington. Noel Vest, he is a PhD and he was a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University in California, and he just accepted a position at Boston University. There are a number of people. Martin Leva, I think, is at University of California, Santa Barbara. Stanley Andres was at Johns Hopkins University. Now he's at Brown University. He's an endocrinologist. So I just named like 5 people who are professors. There are far more than that. There's Terrence Coffey. There's Jeffrey Ian Ross. There are quite a few people who have served time in prison and are working as professors at the academic level. So people have become lawyers, people have become professors, people like myself are actually working back inside the prison system. But that's not the only sort of what I would call non-traditional jobs. There are people who are actually working in like the nursing field or have more professional jobs, especially when it comes to like starting their own businesses. Starting your own business has been another one of those traditional outlets for somebody with the business knowledge and the savvy. If they've been to prison, they can start their own business. And I am in contact with people who have become millionaires, very successful business owners, either in real estate or owning an HVAC business, owning apartment complexes and in duplexes, even just landholders. So I know people who are formerly incarcerated who have done very successful in the world of real estate as well. When I am asked what kind of jobs can a felon get, I tell people that the list of jobs that people with felonies can get is expanding rapidly. And that's not the question they should be asking. We should only be asking what kind of jobs can they not get. The kind of jobs that people with a felony cannot get are like, you're not likely to become a police officer. You're not likely to become a doctor who's able to prescribe medicine. You're not likely to become president. So the scope of jobs for people who are formerly incarcerated, have felonies, is shrinking dramatically. One more cultural referent that I will bring up is George Floyd. So regardless of your opinion on the George Floyd case, and regardless of your opinion of all the rioting and the violence and the drama that happened as a result of that in the summer of 2020, companies all across the country began to open up their doors to people who have felony convictions, because what happened with George Floyd incited more of this movement towards criminal justice, corrections, policing, and that sort of thing. I have to stress that it really doesn't matter what your opinion of it is, if you are for all of the movement and changes in language or not. It's a fact that it occurred, and it had a really big influence on the way people view those who have been involved with the criminal justice system. Oh, and one last thing I'll say about cultural movements. There's a site called Career One Stop. Career One Stop used to have a page on it. So Career One Stop is helping people find work. It's got a bunch of resources on resumes and job interviews. It's got a database where you can search for jobs in your area according to different industries. It's got a lot of great things if you're looking for employment. And it used to have a page called Jobs for Workers with a Conviction. And when you go to one of the pages, it says, who's hiring people with a criminal background? You click on it and it'll say, it would be great if there were a definitive list of employers or people who are hiring those with a criminal background, but in reality, that list doesn't exist. Well, that page has been taken down. There's been some things changed up because now there are some generally reliable lists of felony-friendly employers. And that leads me to my next major discussion, which is how to understand felony-friendly lists that you might find online or pieces of paper floating around the day room that say what employers are hiring those with criminal backgrounds.